Are mass shootings ultimately the failure of a centralized government? Should members of Congress be paid the average of the district they represent? And is wokeness cruelty armored in false virtue? We'll discuss these takes and more on today's episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of the Good Take, Bad Take podcast. This is the show where we find takes that we see in our social media feeds each week, and we evaluate them, take them apart, build them up, tear them down, whatever we think, depending on whether they're good or bad. My name is Britt. I'm here with my co-host Donnie. And before we get started, make sure to like, share, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff that helps us out. You can find us on Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram and on Twitter and YouTube at Good Bad Take Pod. Without further ado, let's get into some of these takes. So the first one we got is from Matt Kivy on Twitter, and he writes, "Every time a deranged person uses a gun to kill innocents, it's a failure of centralized government policing to keep people safe. It's both incompetence and ultimately the impossibility of the mission itself. Yet the response from anti-2A activists is always double down on a failed system and strip rights and guns from law-abiding citizens. The real first responders in the next random attack from a twisted mind." What do you think?
I think that's great. In particular, the line, the impossibility of the mission itself. Yeah. It's so accurate. It's crazy. You think about it in the terms of, freedom and security are in some ways, not always and exclusively, but in some ways they are a sliding scale when you're talking about, I shouldn't say security, because I think that that's maybe a bit of a I think that's a false choice, but government provided security, I will say. Freedom and government provided security are on a scale where you can have a reasonable amount of government provided security, but if you have that, it's specifically at the expense of freedom. And you can make the argument, as a lot of conservatives do, that there is a ratio that is worth it for that exchange. But I don't think that that's the binary we need to think, because at that point it's like you're Sisyphus rolling the boulder up the hill, where you're trying to achieve this perfect balance of where your freedom and liberties are still intact, but the government's providing the security in such a way that it is an impossible task that you'll never fall on the right side of. And so rather than trying to entrench yourself into a system that is destined to fail, you need to recognize we don't actually have to trade off security for freedom. Freedom provides security. If you give, people have to be proactive in giving themselves that security. But if you teach a culture to do that and to provide for themselves, then you can have freedom and security. It doesn't have to be a trade-off. With the government, it's always a trade-off. But if you can teach people to be individually responsible and use their freedom in such a way that promotes security, then you don't have to have that trade-off. It kind of makes me think of this analogy, this like poll that was on Twitter, and the premise was, if you press the red button, you live, and if you press the blue button, if more than 50% of people press this blue button, everyone survives, no matter what button they pressed. And so the initial thinking that people had was, well, I want to press the blue button because I want to be nice. I want to make sure everyone's, and if enough people do that, then everyone lives. It doesn't matter. But of course, that's a ridiculous way to think about it, because if everyone just presses the red button, which saves themselves, then everyone survives anyway. There's no reason to not press the red button. The only thing you're doing by pressing the blue button is putting yourself at risk. And that's what it feels like to me with these government trade-offs, where it's like, if we promote a culture of individual rights, and we promote a culture of protecting yourself by using responsible gun ownership or whatever means you have to self-defense, then everyone has that ability. Or you figure out a way voluntarily to have people provide that for you. But instead, we have a government where it's like, well, if the government system works well enough, if we get enough people doing the right thing, if we get a system that's strong enough and secure enough and not corrupt, then it will work. And it's like, that's never the guarantee. There's no reason to go for that when you can instead promote a culture that's actually going to do something beneficial and have people protecting themselves and their loved ones and immediate surrounding family.
Yeah, I really like your your analysis of that meme, because it really is true. It's like it's actually the people who are pushing the blue button that actually make it possible for half of everyone to die. If everyone just did what makes sense, everyone would make it out. This reminds me of there's a Twitter post that's pretty famous, and it's basically like, it's like, well, people will say like, how are you going to defend yourself if we take the guns away? And like, but there won't be a gun in the bad guy's hand if we take all the guns away. And it's like, what an ignorant statement, right? As someone who has never lived under any sort of threat of attack or in a dangerous area or witnessed or experienced any sort of violence upon themselves, the fact of the matter is that the majority of gun-related homicides occur with guns that should not have been in the perpetrator's hand in the first place. And they're usually handguns. They're usually not the guns that they want to ban, the big, black, scary assault rifles that everyone, demonizes. They're usually done by handguns, which, some Democrats would like to ban those too, but most of the time that's not on the docket to be banned because they don't elicit the same emotional reaction. But the fact of the matter is that, and this is a cliche, but really the only way that a bad guy is stopped is either by them shooting themselves with the gun that they have in their hand, or a good guy coming in and disabling them. And basically all of the time they're going to be disabled with the same level of force that the bad guy is perpetrating on innocents. And so it's kind of like in Harry Potter. Like I have to stay up late with my new baby, and so I've been watching through all the Harry Potter series, and the one where they've got Umbridge in it, and she goes in and she's teaching the class in defense against the dark arts. And she's like, we're not going to focus on, defensive practical magic. Like, we're going to just learn theory, because you don't actually need to learn any of that. We have, the auras and the official Ministry of Magic people that can protect you. Like, good heavens, why would you ever need to learn to defend yourself? And Harry's like, well, because we were attacked by Voldemort, like it actually happens. Like, we need this in reality, in practice. And it kind of comes out that like she's actually just trying to soften everyone up to be at the whim of the Ministry of Magic and eventually, Voldemort in the end. And so, these in practice and reality, it sounds nice for there to be like some universal, moral, all-powerful system that protects all of us, and we can rely on them and count on them 100% of the time. But it really is true that when seconds matter, the police are minutes or tens of minutes away from you. They're not actually able to help you. They're law enforcement. They are not law, or they're not crime prevention. They only enforce or come to do the law after it has been broken. And in the most important scenarios where your life or the life of your family is at risk, they are not going to be able to make it there in time. Your life is in your own hands. And and if it's not in your own hands, like if you don't have a tool or an implement to defend yourself, it is now in the hands of the person that does have that tool that might wish you and your family ill will.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I the other thing about it too is this is specifically responding to the mass shooting that happened somewhat recently. I don't remember exactly where. Was it Maine, I think, maybe?
Yes.
And it's like, I don't know. I'm not here to spread conspiracy theories, but the best case scenario of this is government failure, like Matt Kibbe said, right? Like they're not able to centrally go in and protect, even though they have the monopoly. That's allegedly their job. They have the monopoly on force. And then you get things where like the official reported narrative at the very outset, and I haven't heard a ton of the development on it, but it was like, oh, the guy got away and they chased him down and they found him and he'd committed suicide with 2 bullet wounds to the head. 2 bullet wounds to the head. He committed suicide with 2 bullet wounds to the head. And I thought
that was a joke. I didn't know that was the actual report.
That was the initial report that was coming out. And maybe they debunked that, but those were certain things. And it's like, look, like to me, it's not even a case like this guy totally could have killed himself, and a lot of people do. So I'm not saying this was the government, but the fact that either that was the official first report or it was being said shows the level of distrust the average person has for our government regardless. So to me, it's like, it may not be true. It might be true, but regardless, like that's the fact that there's a good number of people who will hear that and think like, that's 100% what's going on. Those people are the ones who we're distrusting, are the ones that are supposed to be responsible for our safety and are supposed to be the ones who we're like supposed to hand everything over and say, you know what? I don't need this kind of a weapon because they've got my back covered. That's just crazy. Like what? That's where we're at. And yet conservatives will still, after, either spreading a rumor of this or hearing this and being disgusted, they'll still say, yeah, but we need the police to take care of this, which is just crazy because it's like, this is all the same organization that at best had a failure and at worst is doing something kind of sketchy. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure this is the case for the main shooter, as well as Uvalde and several others more as of late, which the FBI will release a statement. It's like, oh yeah, they were on our radar because they either purchased a bunch of stuff and it was flagged, or they maybe they got the gun in some way that was going to trigger a flag, or maybe they had posted or checked into they had gotten the gun and then they had checked into some sort of mental facility or something similar to that. And it's like, okay, so all these mass shooters, the systems that are in place in some very, very strict places for gun control popped up on the federal level. The FBI, the all-seeing, all-knowing, the end-all, be-all ability to make outcomes happen in the United States popped up on their radar, and they weren't able to prevent it. And it's like, yeah, okay, so then who is going to prevent it? Are you just going to wait for it to happen and then do it? It's like, because the whole point of like gun control is to be preventative. But even when they have all of the scenarios lined up, all of the flags are out there, all of the signs are there, they can't prevent it even then. So it's like, okay, I guess then the thing is that it has to be a little bit more, prescriptive once the actual situation happens. Otherwise, they're just going to have you be a sitting duck out there. And that's kind of the only solution you're left with if you live in one of these cities that won't allow you to carry a gun or allow you to even own a weapon in your own home. It's that you have to wait for this big bad FBI to come and stop people. And if they can't stop them, then you're just kind of shoot out of luck, which sucks.
Yeah, absolutely right.
All right, moving on to our next one. We've got Brandon Herrera, and he writes, members of Congress should get paid the average salary of the citizens of their district. Change my mind. What do you think, Donnie?
Well, I honestly don't know, because on the one hand, I'm like, do we have to pay them? And I'm like, I don't like that. On the other hand, maybe the thought behind it is good. I'm just a little hesitant to get all on board, because then I think about like DC and like that area, and you're like, oh, so the Virginia senators are going to be like rolling in, the funds, and I could see a world in which all this ends up doing is spiraling the lobbying forces of senators to really want to pump up, industry in their state in an even more artificial way. That being said, there is something to be said about it being a good incentive creator for the prosperity of a specific state. Again, there's also kind of like a balancing act to do with cost of living. So the dollar amount you earn in one state is not going to be the same relative to the local economy as somewhere else. Your $5 goes a lot farther in Montana than it does in Washington, kind of a thing. So I don't know. I'm not exactly sure what I think of this take. I don't. My instinct is I'm a little skeptical of if it would actually work, but I maybe appreciate the intent behind it.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I was the exact same boat as you. My thought was I appreciate the spirit of the take. I actually hate the implementation of it because
do you? Yeah.
Yeah. The incentives, like what this, like in Seattle, if you want to get paid the average salary of the citizens in your district, like let's just raise the minimum wage to $15, $20, $30, and then I will go live someplace else that is not, not as expensive or whatever. So it creates incentives in the same way that like taking some sort of medication to regulate your your blood sugar does. But it's like, yeah, the best way to regulate your blood sugar without like potentially screwing everything up is to just like get healthy. For most people, is to get healthy, to eat properly and do all those types of good things that are natural. So then your body is incentivized naturally to process things the way it should. In the same way, the markets should be incentivized naturally to do the right thing. And when you have someone in there that is not an expert in any of the fields that they are making legislation on, because no one can be, and they are, have perverse incentives, right or wrong, meaning their entire salary is based off of basically a popularity contest. Like they want to stay in office and they want to extract as much value out of the office as they can. And then if you add this third incentive of like, well, then I need to, focus on one aspect of my citizenry that's kind of directly tied to my pay, which is, raise their wages. It's kind of like if you give, like in computer programming, like computers are really dumb. And so when you're programming and writing code, you need to make sure that you're really, really explicit about everything that you want the computer to do, because it will do exactly as it's told. It's kind of like Michael Scott when he's told to hand out the leads in one of the Office episodes. He's supposed to hand them out to the salespeople, and he's like, "Oh, I'm going to hand out the leads to the staff." And he's like, and they're like, "Okay, that sounds good." He's like, "I'm going to do exactly that." And he hands it to all of the non-sales staff because he wants to get back at the salespeople. That's what a computer does. That's what kind of like incentives function for politicians, is they will focus and fixate on the thing that extracts the most value for them, because they're not actually tied to outcomes. They're tied to whatever increases their personal power and personal finance. And so I think that this, like, I think at a macro scale, like if we just think of Congress and we think of politicians as their district being the United States, I know it's not the exact right way to think of it, but you could see how this plays out. Like their salary is raised and changed based upon like cost of living. And what does raise the cost of living? Oh, they print money. And who gets to decide where that money is dropped off first and gets to reap the most benefit from it from the first, at the most benefit at all from it? It's the politicians. So I think we already do see this played out, just maybe in a little bit more abstracted way. I think even if we abstract it more or whatever, it's not actually going to yield a better result. I think we're going to see more of the same, because you have someone at the top calling all the shots in such a way that they are not incentivized properly.
Yeah, I think this is one of those takes where it strikes me as a very similar thing to people who really want term limits, where it's like, okay, I understand the impetus behind wanting some of these term limits, and it comes from a good place, but ultimately it is a little lacking in what it will accomplish and what you want it to accomplish, because the machine that's set up around the sort of the platonic ideal of what our government is makes the ideal of, or the idea of that government, not what it is. So what I mean by that is we talk about elective democracy. If your politician does something that you don't want him to do and isn't representing your district well, you can vote in someone new, and that's kind of the platonic ideal we have of our democracy. In reality, it's like, okay, there is the swamp, as Trump called it, but really this entrenched bureaucracy that has its agenda, that has what it wants. The lobbyists from big government, or for big corporations that do backdoor deals with big government. So it doesn't really matter what senator or representatives in there. A lot of the time, you're gonna get the same outcomes. And so in that sense, term limits don't really do as much as we want them to. And so in the same way, it's like, the Federal Reserve, oh yeah, this private organization that just so happens to print money at the exact, time and place that the government demands it to, it exists so that you can change these numbers out. You can artificially pump up minimum wage laws. You'll have senator influence into your local state politics in order to get these policies change so that they get more money, like you pointed out. I think that's an astute observation. So it's one of those things where it's kind of like the incremental change might be good for like 5 years, and then it kind of corrects itself because of this machine that comes around it. If you keep on, like if that was a first step, and then you kept doing things that incentivize them, and you strip away more and more powers of the government and tie more of the performance to incentives, maybe it would work. But I think this would have to be, in sort of the best case scenario, this would have to be the first of many things,
yes,
in order for it to
it won't function with this being the primary mode of incentive. Like it eventually will regress into what we have today, just at a smaller or larger scale, depending on where it's applied.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
All right, moving on to our next one. We've got Elon Musk, and it's a quote from the Babylon Bee, and it writes, "At its heart, wokeness is divisive, exclusionary, and hateful. It basically gives mean people a shield to be mean and cruel, armored in false virtue." What do you think?
I think this is a really good take on wokeness. I wouldn't say it was like the definition of wokeness necessarily, but I think it's a very astute and interesting observation about its nature. It's the way that we saw during the COVID years, the petty tyrants come out in particular, the way that we saw people just looking for reasons to demonize another subsect of people, the unmasked, the unvaccinated, the the COVID, the people who didn't trust the science, the little ways they would make you stand at certain ways when it made no sense. The way they made you wear the mask until you sat down and then pulled it down to eat food. Like all of these just things that at its core it made no sense, but it was a way to view yourself as virtuous when all you were doing was being divisive and cruel. That is such a good definition for what wokeness really is at its core. In the best understanding of what wokeness is it's supposed to be an awareness of the situation of past segregation, but an awareness of that kinds of segregation and mistreatment would lend itself into believing that you shouldn't treat people that way. But the wokeness we have now isn't one that teaches us not to divide in that, but rather you need to do it exactly back on the people who once did it. Two wrongs make a right. That's the heart of it. But I would argue that it's not even doing so out of a sense of like, this is the best path forward, because I think that so many of them are honestly, they do it because it feels good to be vindictive, not because I think that this is going to solve the problem in the long term.
It's very similar to the first take that we did about gun laws, in that many people that hold very woke views hardly ever encounter the reality of the view, or the reality that their views would create when implemented. And I remember there was this gal in college that I knew, and very, very, very liberal and lefty, and then very critical of like how homeless folks here in Seattle were treated and things like that, and not in the way of like, hey, we need to have less homeless people and we shouldn't tolerate stuff, but more like, oh no, we should be subsidizing them and giving them these services and that services, and stop trying to kick them off of park benches and things like that. And it was okay for her living in the richest neighborhood in Washington State, where Microsoft and Google and all these huge companies are, and there are no homeless people wandering around because the streets are kept clean. But the second that she wasn't able to live in that town anymore, and she moved to actual Seattle, and part of the where she'd had to go walk to her apartment, she'd have to walk by a vacant parking lot that had a homeless encampment with people selling cocaine and various other activities. Suddenly she became very, very quote unquote conservative, and that's like, oh no, I just don't feel safe walking by this parking lot anymore. It's like, yeah, that veil of virtue that you had, that you could look down on other people when you were in college and you lived in this rich neighborhood, it suddenly disappeared when you were confronted with the actual reality of the situation. And that's what happens with a lot of these folks. But unfortunately, they actually occupy, even by their standards, the most privileged strata of society, because they can make these claims without ever having to actually encounter the outcome of these things occurring. And they lie to themselves. And it reminded me of the C.S. Lewis quote, which is, the robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own goodwill will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. And he's talking about people that are tyrants, but they believe that what they're doing is right. And I think that a lot of these woke folks, I don't think they actually believe what they're doing is right, but I think they believe that feeling good about what they are doing means that it is right. And so, I had another friend in college, and his sister, she would, in high school, would call him gay and other slurs of that nature, saying like slurs about people that are gay. And then now she is very much a lefty, pronouns. Literally, I saw her post a meme about violence upon people who are LGBTQ. And it's like, yeah, you just 10 years ago were the very bully in high school that you are now demonizing now, but you just have looked for a different way to bully people, around. And that's really what it is. Is a lot of the folks that were being awful and nasty 10 years ago now have just found the different vector for it, where they can continue to cover up, and they can persecute people without violating their conscience.
Yeah, that's one of the most interesting things about wokeness is, and this is not true of everyone who would call themselves woke.
Sure.
Okay, so I want to be clear. In fact, I have a friend, a mutual friend of ours actually, who was briefly a housemate of mine, and I would consider him on that as specifically not one of these people but there's so many people who are in this category of woke who weren't not that long ago, and have no grace for people who are not woke. And that's the interesting thing to me, because for instance, if you were raised a certain way or grew up thinking that there was a normal and you weren't aware of something else, or you even actively chose something else. And then you get your mind changed, and now you are this new thing of like woke. The posture I would assume would be, hey, you know what? I've been there. Here's why I think you should adopt my worldview. And I, sometimes I'm a little bit spicier towards conservatives, but that's the posture I try to take, especially when I'm talking to conservatives in person or on specific issues. Like, yeah, I used to think like that too, but here's why I don't think it works now. The idea is like I have an understanding of where they're coming from, because that was me for a while. But the interesting thing is, like in your example of the person who's now just a different form of the bully they once were before, is that so many people who are in this woke movement aren't doing it from the heart. They're doing it for the control, for the power, to be a bully. They're doing it to beat people over the head, not to, it's to say, hey, get on my team or else, not out of a, hey, I understand where you're coming from. Here's what changed my mind. And there are, like I said, there are people who are like that. And there's probably a disproportionate number of them compared to what you see online and things like that. Sure. But it is telling to me that the most visible and revolutionary proponents who push this actively are not in that camp. And so that to me is like where Elon's point is very true, that it is divisive, exclusionary, hateful, and it gives people that veneer to be mean while looking virtuous. People are doing it not out of a genuine sense of morality, but out of sort of the, almost like the cultural Christians who liked, telling people, oh, don't sleep around, don't do this, don't do that, but without any of the heart behind why that mattered. They were just telling people to not do things because it was a rule they could enforce, without understanding why it was actually a good rule or why it was important and why it helped give life and things like that.
Yeah, and I think those, like you were mentioning, our mutual friend and some of the other folks that hold woke views but are not insufferable in the way they practice them. I think they are just really pragmatists at heart that view certain woke ways of like operating as the best way to get to it, because they're usually very sympathetic and empathetic. And they really do care about people, and maybe there just need to be. And what I find with a lot of those folks, at least, is that you can have an actual conversation with them, a debate back and forth, and instead of you arguing about like how we are getting to a place, we're actually just arguing about how we get there, where the desire is human flourishing. Everyone is doing really well and doing awesome, and our argument is really just like, okay, like, well, what's the best method of reaching that destination? What's funny about, like, as I think about like high school and college, and I when I think of people now, and people from high school that I follow on Instagram or I see still in real life every now and then, I can usually predict the certain type of person that in high school, what type of views they have today. And a lot of the people that I knew in high school or in college that were kind of this combination of really, really trendy, along with very authority-minded. So anything authority put in their purview as the correct thing was the thing that they were going to parrot, and they usually couldn't defend it. Those people have become woke. And it's usually that combination of like, well, I need to outsource my thinking to the authority, and I also want to do whatever is fashionable, and whatever is fashionable is actually dictated to me by authority. Those are the type of people that like I didn't like in high school, because I was like, well, if you're telling me to do something and you can't justify it, or you have this view and you can't justify it other than like, well, this person said it, or it's the right thing to do, without actually any reasoning to back it up, like I don't want to listen to you, and I don't want to be around you. Like those same people are also now parodying this woke stuff. What's funny, again, like I was saying before, is things 10, 15, 20 years ago that were both, pushed down by authority and were trendy, making fun of gay people or calling people retarded or things like that. Like those people said them back then because it was accepted and it was trendy. And then today they would turn around and they would crucify their past selves if they met them. And that's just kind of the thing that we need to wake people up from, is that's like, hey, like maybe you could adopt a principle. Maybe you shouldn't be looking to authority as the only source of your ability to determine what is right or wrong. Maybe you should have an underlying reason for why you believe something is moral, because then you can actually be consistent throughout your entire life, not just for what is trendy and moves with the times right now.
Yep, that's exactly right. That's very well put.
All right, moving on to our next one. We've got Michael Tracy, and he is quoting Mike Johnson when he was on Sean Hannity. Mike Johnson, the new GOP Speaker of the House, tells Sean Hannity, we can't allow Putin to prevail in Ukraine. U.S. boots on the ground may be required to stand with Israel. He supports Israel directly attacking Iran. And Russia, China, and Iran are now the new axis of evil. What do you think about Mike Johnson and more specifically his foreign policy chops here?
The good old Tom Woods rule comes to mind. The Woods, I don't remember the full title. The Woods rule of politicians: no matter who you elect, you always end up with John McCain. And I'm not gonna lie, that this is really cringe and disappointing. I like the majority of Americans had probably never really heard of Mike Johnson before he emerged as this consensus candidate between Jim Jordan and Kevin McCarthy. And, Jim Jordan's got his faults for sure, but I think he would have been a heck of a lot better on some of this, at least.
He at least has a persona as being better on it.
Exactly. Yeah, he has a reputation he would have had to manage to keep accountable to the people who would have pushed back on some of this. So this is, we've talked a decent amount about these particular issues. So we could go into them again more. I didn't throw this in for anything particularly deep, but I did just want to say that, people wonder how the swamp operates. People wonder how we keep, electing people. We every year people complain, Congress's approval numbers are always super low and yet nothing changes. And this is just another example of that. People always complain about their Congress, but their specific representatives always win. I can't remember the exact percentage, but every election cycle, incumbents win a majority of the races, and so it's just very funny to me. This is just another example where it's like, okay, we were supposed to have this new person, this new compromise. We ousted the old guard. Matt Gaetz led the charge, and then they accepted this new guy, and he's kind of just more of the same old. So unless he's like an incredible parliamentarian who allows individual members to bring bills and we have real voices being heard, not just the corporate ones, unless we get that, I don't think that we're going to have much of a step up from Kevin McCarthy, which really I should have and could have predicted.
Yeah, I can't ever tell, like, with these guys, like, if they are purposely out of touch with the American people, because like you would think, or not even the American people, just like Republicans out of touch with the actual Republican base. Like I don't know how you could look at the past year outside of Israel, to be clear, but at least on Ukraine, and think that like, oh yeah, the popularity thing for me to do in service of popularity would be to hype up putting boots on the ground in you, or I guess he didn't advocate for that in this, but not allowing Putin to prevail in Ukraine and putting these countries on the axis of evil, the Bush coined term when he was putting like North Korea on the axis of evil and terrorism with Al Qaeda. And it's like, yeah, man, like these things don't resonate. And a lot of people see through it. We know that like this is all kind of like the equivalent of a marketing buzz term. And it reminds me of like a marketing executive that's like 55 years old or whatever. And like he thinks that like, oh, the cool thing when I was, 25 was to have, some sort of like a raffle drawing that we mail out to people and they fill it out and they mail it back to us. And then it's going to increase our business by 30%. It's like, yeah, that was really cool in the 90s, maybe. But now we have the internet and it doesn't work like that. And so like this guy, and I don't think Mike Johnson's that old, but him using terms like, well, we need to put boots on the ground in Israel and we stand with them. And Russia, China, and Iran are the new axis of evil. It's like, man, that's like the foreign policy talking points that resonated with Republicans 25 years ago. It doesn't resonate with the Republicans anymore. So why are you saying that? And it also makes me skeptical because like you were saying, no one was aware of this dude. He kind of came out of nowhere. And so it kind of adds to that feeling of no matter who you vote for, you get John McCain. It's like, oh yeah, the people that we did know got ousted or weren't allowed in. And so now the powers that be who actually control everything put some no name and as bland as Mike Johnson as the guy that's going to come in and guess what? He's also going to parrot all the same talking points that we were going to get with any other sort of neocon warhawk out there. So yeah, it's just what a disappointment, but also how expected, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, and the other thing about it too is, it's frustrating because if we had gotten Mike Johnson before this whole Israel thing, I would, and maybe should go back and look. Maybe I should. I just want to. I wonder what his rhetoric was on foreign policy in general. Like, was he always this lame? Because if he was always this lame on foreign policy, shame on Republicans for compromising and putting him as the Speaker of the House. If he wasn't this lame on foreign policy, at least vocally, well, then shame on him for flopping to the tides of the winds. Kind of like our friend Vivek Ramaswamy has done. I don't know if you saw his absolutely horrible take. I considered putting it in, but I think it's been done to death. But it's disappointing. For some reason, Israel gives conservatives like the switch, like you said, that like it's 25 years ago. We're going straight back to those points. Like we've learned absolutely nothing from the foreign policy lessons that have ensued since then, and frankly before then. But more back to back to back in front of our eyes and transparently in our lifetimes, really.
Yeah, agree with you there. All right, let us move on to the next one. And I lost my arrow. Okay, here I've got it here. All right, we've got Zuby. And we got a follow-up comment to his tweet. So Zuby writes, if conservatives were serious about encouraging more young people to get married, start families, and stay married, they would seek to change the policies and cultural trends that massively disincentivize it. I see little appetite for that, to be honest. Someone followed up with a comment, I feel like we're a nation that seeks four-year solutions to generational problems. What do you think about this whole exchange?
I think it's great. I think that it's one of the things that I like both takes here, and I liked the bottom line as a sort of a summary of where we are. And I mean, this is kind of one of the central critiques that Hans Hermann Hoppe offers in Democracy, the God That Failed, is the fact that, oh, great, we're term limited. Okay, so we can burn the turf and extract everything in the short term, and then your fields are on fire, but it's okay because we've defeated the enemy, my enemy, but now I'm leaving this mess for someone else to clean up. And so that's kind of one of the critiques. And I think that culture has infested every aspect of our country. Unfortunately, we think in these four-year terms. The more that we've seen the government grow and become involved in everyday life, the more that every individual cares about it, the more they feel like it's the government's burden to fix cultural issues. And I think sometimes conservatives are just as, maybe not just as, but they are also prone to this kind of thinking in ways that liberals tend to be more of. And so what you end up with is more and more a culture that not only is trying to find solutions that are based in government policies and government responses, but then by the nature of the government we have, it's a 4-year solution to a generational problem, because you don't want to be the politician who doesn't get reelected because you do something that's very unpopular in the short term, that's going to take more than 4 years for the fruits to pay off. So the more that we seed the ground of things like the cultural change and stopping bad policy before it becomes an official policy, stopping these things from being even considered okay in the culture, we just kind of wait. We say, oh, well, we may not like it, but we can't enforce our views on anybody else. So then you don't make a stand for it at all. And then it gets adopted into the government. And then the government forces you to do the bad thing. And then by the time it's time for cleanup, you've got a huge mess on your hands. And so even if you move in the right direction, it'd be so wildly unpopular that you couldn't do it in 4 years. And if you do try to do it in 4 years, you're kicking the can down the road. So there's so much about this that I like. And it's kind of this terrible cycle that feeds into itself. And I think that this puts it pretty aptly.
Yeah, I was just talking with someone, a younger guy, and he was lamenting about how he lives down south in California, and he was lamenting about how difficult it is for him to save up to get married, and even if he could save up to buy a ring and like pay for a wedding and all this stuff, just the cost of living to be married with two people, and feeling like you can support someone else off of that and potentially kids down the line and things like that was just too high. And it's just really unfortunate that, I mean, obviously that situation is unfortunate because he works hard, has a normal job, all that stuff, and he feels that type of pressure. But the cause of that pressure is so for lack of a better term, not sexy to talk about. It's not something that spurs the emotion, like talking about the minimum wage law or or gets you up and running, thinking about like talking about innocent Ukrainians being killed or something like that, is something as nerdy as the Federal Reserve and interest rates. Something that's kind of nebulous, kind of difficult to understand, not really something you can say into slogans and get your point across, without having to put much thought or effort into it. It's like actually takes a bit of time to sit down and discuss. But it's so like, it's the most evil thing that we've got, because it totally disincentivizes any sort of responsible living. It disincentivizes the ability for people to get married and to have human flourishing and create more humans. And it incentivizes bad behaviors as well. It incentivizes not saving, like it incentivizes, let's go spend money and spend it on things that are speculative or that don't maintain their value and don't hold it. But until you can have that discussion, until you can have that out on the floor, which I really appreciated, I wasn't able to vote in the 2008 election, but when Ron Paul during the debates would talk about these things, it's like, oh yeah, now you've got that type of idea simply put out in front of the world. And even simply put, it's really, really difficult. But these things are really evil, but they're like tied to, and I was talking with someone else about like how like the boomers in a lot of ways are a really awful generation. They kind of sold out the future generations. And they're like, well, how did they do that? It's like, well, they didn't directly set interest rates, but they had behaviors and voted in accordance with, without thinking about like, hey, how are these politicians going to set interest rates? And politicians were incentivized to keep interest rates low so that people could get rich off of just buying a house and living in it. And so like, yeah, it's a little bit abstracted, but the correlation and the causation is there. There was a generation that voted on what they thought would benefit them without thinking about the future consequences of it. And now the end result is that like a young man that is 24 years old can't purchase a ring or buy a house or do anything, even though he works 2 jobs full time and does a really, really good job. It's like you sold it out for that person, and you don't necessarily see it, the moment that you do it, but it is there and it is caused by that. But like, that's like this guy's saying, it's a generational thing to talk about. It can't be solved in 4 years. If we said, hey, interest rates now are free, like banks can set their own, like there'd be a lot of pain in 4 years. The person that put that into motion would not be elected in the next season, in the next cycle. So it'd be now up to the fate of the next person that got elected to now also hold that view. And it's like over the course of 3, 4, maybe 5 generations, 20 years of having interest rates correct the market, then we'd start to see some dividends on it. We'd actually see some freedom. We'd actually see some more flourishing. Things would correct themselves. But I just don't think any of us have the ability or the wherewithal to make those types of decisions.
Yeah, and I think that some of that, not all of that, but some of that is really a result of this weird acceptance of government taking on personal problems and things like that. And not specifically with the fiscal examples that you gave. I think those are more directly policy related. But I think that even things like the cultural acceptance of the idea of all the different social safety nets we have, like it's one of those things where, yes, in principle, the idea of having a baseline for people to be able to fall back on is okay. But once you cede that to the government, it will never stop, and the entitlements keep building, and then it becomes people don't feel the need to help their neighbor. They don't feel the need to volunteer their time helping out people who are less fortunate. You end up ceding that to the government, and then the government creates this unsustainable safety net, the social safety net. And then what ends up happening is then you have people who want to game the system, and then you have a generation brought up on welfare. You have incentives to have people not work in certain ways, and then you teach that not just a sort of a one-off, but you have families that are raised that way, and then it becomes kind of a culture. And it's not attractive to say that, because there are a lot of people who need a social safety net of sorts, and are working hard. That's true. But when it's given without restraint, when it's given without any accountability to your community or to people locally, there's no way to separate those people who do need something and would be good beneficiaries of charity and of your community working together to support those people. And you can't separate that from the people who are just going to grift the system, and you create that culture. So now it's like, okay, now if we wanted to fix the social safety net that is, never feasibly going to be able to be solvent, now we've created a much bigger problem for ourselves down the road. And that's the crazy thing about it is like people always act like, oh, well, the government's doing this thing in the name of good. Like, sorry to keep rambling here, but another take I saw recently was Reason Magazine reported on this government-run grocery store that lost a bunch of money, basically, and it was taxpayer subsidized to offer very low prices for everything. And so the Reason article saying, hey, this money, or this grocery store that's taxpayer subsidized lost a ton of money, and now the government wants to open more. And I saw this take of this person being like, the funny thing about libertarians is, like, they can't understand that, this losing money is literally helping the community or helping poor people eat. And it was like these Christian guys going on about that. And I'm like, no, the problem isn't that there was an organization helping people eat. That isn't the issue. The issue is that it is an unsustainable way for it for something to operate like that. The issue isn't that it existed. The issue is that they're taking taxpayer money and creating something that's unsustainable, and then they want to expand that, and then other people end up paying for something that will be necessarily inefficient and create bad incentive structures. It's like the whole meme about teach or give someone a fish they eat for a day, teach them to fish they eat for a lifetime. Or even the critiques that people have with missionaries who go in and like donate a bunch of goods and services to a village, like a bunch of shoes, put the local shoemaker out of business, and then once all those shoes are used up, they're the worse off because the shoemaker couldn't stay in business and create sustainable things. Obviously, charity is good, and we want that. But the problem is when you set it up in these guises of like a local grocery store that you want to keep expanding on and opening more to people. The problem is at that point you're enabling a long-term dependency on subsidized artificial prices that will not sustain itself. The problem isn't that you're helping people eat. The problem is you've created a system that just isn't sustainable, and that is the issue with the government in all of these different ways that are creating sort of lifetime problems.
I like it. I don't have any more to add on it unless you do.
Nope, I think we're good.
Awesome. Well, friends, thank you so much for hanging out with us. We really appreciate you taking time every day to listen to these takes, and we'll catch you on the next one.